The Prelude is one of three poems from the Power and Conflict collection which come from the Romantic tradition, and when we talk about Romantic poetry we aren't talking about love poetry, but poetry where there is a sudden emotional or imaginative experience, an idealised vision of childhood, feelings of wonder or awe. Now that word awe is the feeling that you get when you're presented with nature on a grand scale and feel perhaps admiration but also horror as well. An emphasis on the creative power of the imagination and an almost religious response to the natural world, and this last one is particularly true of the poet Wordsworth. Wordsworth is sometimes referred to as one of the lake poets, as he grew up and lived around the Lake District in the northwest of England, and we can certainly see the influence of this location in this particular poem. And this extract is taken from the first book of Wordsworth's 14-book Prelude, which can be thought of as a sort of autobiography written in the form of a poem. And the extract which we're going to have a look at is usually referred to as the boat stealing episode, because in it a young Wordsworth finds a small boat tied to a willow tree and he takes it and rows out across the lake. And it's the experience that Wordsworth has while on the lake and the lasting impact of this experience which is the main point of interest in this poem. One summer evening, led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. Straight I unloosed her chain and, stepping in, pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure, nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on, leaving behind her still on either side small circles glittering idly in the moon, until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. But now, like one who rows proud of his skill to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line, I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge, the horizon's utmost boundary. Far above was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. She was an elfin pinnace. Lustily I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan, when, from behind that craggy steep, till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct, upreared its head. I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own and measured motion, like a living thing, strode after me. With trembling oars I turned, and through the silent water stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. There, in her mooring place, I left my bark, and through the meadows homeward went in grave and serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle, for many days my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. O'er my thoughts there hung a darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees or sea or sky, no colours of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, moved slowly through the mind by day and were a trouble to my dreams. So, the poem is written in the first person, and we have the pronoun I, which allows us to access the poet's innermost thoughts and feelings. And at the beginning here, Wordsworth is establishing the setting for the poem. It's summertime in the evening, and he's down by the lake. And on first glance, we might think that Wordsworth has introduced another character here, led by her. But this is the poet personifying nature. And so we have an early hint about an important theme of this poem, which is going to be to do the power of nature over people. And here Wordsworth is telling us that nature was guiding him towards this boat, and therefore towards the transformative experience that he is retelling. And you may have noticed already a few things about the structure and beat of the lines in this poem. Wordsworth has written it in iambic pentameter, which are these 10-syllable lines with 5 stresses, with the stress falling on every other syllable, which I've tried to illustrate here. I've sort of overemphasised the beat. One summer evening, led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree. And this, along with the unrhymed lines, the use of enjambment, adds to the conversational style of the poem. Wordsworth felt that poems should be written in the voice of the common man and should be easy to understand, and that is certainly true of the poem we're having a look at here. The beginning of the poem is full of images of beautiful nature, and the speaker is at peace with it. As he pushes out onto the water in the boat, our attention is drawn to the small circles glittering idly in the moon, which are created by the oars dipping into the still water. And this tone is also established through the description of how these circles melt all into one track of sparkling light, and the fact that not even the mountains echoed as he begins to row across the lake. But the word idly, which means inactive or lazy, helps also to create this relaxed, peaceful tone to the opening. The fact that these are small circles is also worth pointing out, because Wordsworth, prior to this transformative moment, found beauty in nature on this sort of scale. Remember, the boat itself is described as little, and the adjective elfin, which I'll mention in a moment in connection with the boat, also means small. We've got a really good example of how alliteration can be used to create sound effects at the end of this section, with the L sound featuring quite heavily. We've got glittering, idly, melted, all sparkling light. And these sounds are called liquids. And in this example, they help to create the impression of the boat moving gently, peacefully, and effortlessly over the water. And in terms of structure, Wordsworth takes us in this poem from this quite innocent and peaceful view of nature on a small scale to something much grander and altogether more threatening. Wordsworth describes the action of taking the boat as an act of stealth and troubled pleasure, which reveals a couple of quite interesting things. Firstly, the word stealth, which suggests youthful daring, like the young Wordsworth is proud of doing something a bit mischievous. The mention of him taking the boat straight away adds to this impression of youthful confidence and impulsiveness. But there is guilt mixed up with this too, which is why we have the oxymoron of pleasure, which is troubled. This youthful energy and impulsiveness is also in evidence in this part of the poem that we have in front of us now. Now, I'm just going to make a point here. Remember that there are no stanzas in this poem. It's written as one continuous piece of verse, and I've only broken it up into these different parts to make it easier for us to analyse. Wordsworth remembers himself feeling proud of what he's doing, and in particular, the way that he is rowing lustily and with an unswerving line. And these details are important because just as Wordsworth's perception of nature is about to change, so is his view of himself. So when I describe this poem as recording a transformative moment in the poet's life, what I mean is that it records the moment when his youthful arrogance is humbled by the awesome power of nature. We can see the beginning of this over the next sequence of lines, firstly with images of boundary and limitation. We see the poet staring fixedly on the horizon, which is described as the utmost boundary, which perhaps works as a metaphor, and we could think that this boundary, the poet's understanding, is about to be crossed. We also have a suggestion of the poet's sudden sense of isolation as he looks up to the stars, and perhaps the juxtaposition of these two images, deliberately put close to each other, these images of nature on a grand scale, the horizon, the sky, the reminder of his relative size and significance. The poet himself is in an elfin pinnace, and a pinnace is a type of boat. And the adjective elfin, along with the size of the boat, which I mentioned a moment ago, also suggests some sort of fairy or otherworldly quality to this event. The simile, which is at the end of this bit, is a bit of an oxymoron, which means a deliberate contradiction. Heaving through the water like a swan is used to describe the movement of the boat across the water, where the image of a swan is suggestive of something effortless and elegant, while the verb heaving conveys the idea of something which requires a great deal of effort. So why the contradiction? Well, it might be that Wordsworth is exploring the idea that human beings can never hope to reproduce the effortless beauty of nature. Or perhaps it's a hint that the poet's youthful confidence is about to be shaken. So before looking in detail at the next 11 lines, it might be quite useful to look at this image, which is a really handy way of explaining what Wordsworth sees and describes. You can see the boat here, with the young Wordsworth rowing, facing the way he has come, not the way he is going. But from where he is at the beginning, here, all he can see is the willow tree and the craggy ridge mentioned at the start, followed by the stars and the endless sky, and eventually, when he's reached a certain point on the surface of the lake, this huge peak appears which dominates the skyline. There is a significant change of tone in this section, indicated by the word when, and as a point about structure, this is almost exactly halfway through the poem, and the language now starts to become much darker and more threatening. We have repetition of the word huge here to emphasize the size of the mountain, and the adjective black, which sounds menacing, and these descriptions work in deliberate contrast to the small-scale nature of the first half of the poem. The mountain is personified over the next few lines as if it had been imbued with some instinctive power, and so the mountain, as if it is some enormous monster, lifts up its head. And of course, the further Wordsworth rows out into the lake as he struck and struck again, if you think back to the picture I showed you, the larger the mountain becomes. The grim shape of this mountain grows in stature, and with these ands that I'll pick out in a moment, they create a sort of breathless quality until the mountain becomes another barrier, this time between himself and the stars. And still the mountain continues to reveal its monstrous scale to the poet, as if it appears to him in this simile, with the mountain striding after him. And this is the sense of awe that I mentioned right at the start of this video, the sense of seeing nature on a huge, grand scale and feeling both fear and wonder at the experience. Try reading these lines over to yourself again and notice the use of alliteration, particularly these S's. See if you can overemphasize these S noises, which is a technique specifically called sibilance, which adds to the sinister tone of the lines. And the impact of this over the poet is significant. The proud rower of before has been replaced with trembling oars, and his actions are now more secretive as he stole back to the covert of the willow tree, as if his newfound knowledge has rendered him guilty, a little bit like Adam and Eve after their expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And this is furthered by the use of the word covert, which is used as a pun to mean both thicket, which is a dense group of bushes, as well as something hidden or secretive. And all of this suggests the young boy's sense of fear and guilt. The final part of the poem is where Wordsworth explores the immediate and lasting impact that this experience had on him. He's described as returning home in grave and serious mood, certainly not with the youthful vitality of before. And the word grave here indicates both the gravity or important nature of what is on his mind, but also hints at the poet's sudden understanding of his own mortality. We can also see the lasting impact here, where Wordsworth writes, "But after I had seen that spectacle, for many days my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being." And this dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being seems to express an initial sense of confusion over what he's witnessed, and he is struggling to make sense of it. But it's something that he's unable to stop thinking about. There hung a darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion, and these thoughts leave him feeling alone, and probably contemplating the fact that his whole view of the world has changed to one where his significance in it has been drastically reduced, and where the pretty images of trees and sea and sky and green fields have been replaced with something huge, mighty, powerful and threatening. They troubled his dreams. In other words, it gave him nightmares for a long time afterwards. Because the young Wordsworth has taken an important step in his intellectual growth towards a realization that man does not have power over nature, but rather nature has power over man.